The Art of War. The Chinese translations are Sun Zi Bing Fa, or Sun Zi, which means Master Sun's and translates to Master Sun's Art of Wars / military methods. The art of war references the art of the tactics used in the wars. What do we know about the authors? The book dates back to the late 5th and early 6th century. There was not one specific author. However, in the book it states, it is not, as traditionally believed, the original product of a single author who supposedly lived during the late 6th and early 5th century BC. So from this text we can see that the book was composed from many authors who contributed to writing throughout these centuries, having the 13th chapter be later added. Why is this book significant? This book is significant because this is the earliest extant Chinese text that talks about the military in-depthly. This text goes right along the Warring States, which we talked about in class. It is a period of time that when welfare was popular. This had a huge impact on developing the Chinese military. The book states that the practice and theories of the war and the outweigh of their opponents, outsmarting their opponents. It did not talk deeply about their use of weapons or chariots. In each chapter, it is dedicated to a certain aspect of these tactics and war theories. This book can also help explain how spiritually and their beliefs were important in their culture and in their beliefs on their social system. The high level of wealth had benefits and could afford more than the lower of the latter. They highly respected people in the highest power, and they believed that it was essential in being successful in the wars. Throughout this presentation, you will learn about the different tactics and how people survived in these times of war.
Chapter 1 of The Art of War. In Chapter 1, he describes 5 factors of war and how it can impact him and the generals. He says that a great-minded general with amazing strategy can defeat a great army. Factor 1, the way. His first factor is the way. And the reason he has it as his first one is because you have to find men that are willing to live and die with you and be same-minded as you and fight for the same factors you want to fight for. He says this because if men are willing to die for the same mission you're going to, they are willing to give everything they have to make sure it succeeds. Factor 2 is heaven. He compares it to yin and yang, cold and hot. He's basically comparing it to, if there's contradiction in these men's mind, they won't fight for everything. They have to be full go at the mission ahead and follow the general's complete lead. Factor 3 is earth. They have to make sure the men know that their time here is limited, and they have to fight for a greater purpose. And the greater purpose is the defending of their country and the defending of their honor. Factor 4 is generalship. Generalship is the most important in my opinion because the general does all the strategics, and he says that great tactics can do anything. The general has to have complete knowledge of the enemy's tactics, what they're going to do, how they're going to fight. The general has to have trust in his men. The men have to have trust in the general. It has to be even. They have to understand that the men are going to have fear, and they're going to have to lead by swift example. Not by words, but they're going to have to lead by fighting with the men. And if the men stir away and try to fight away from these rules, they have to be stern and tough and show the men that it's not allowed to dictate on their own choice. Factor 5 is the method. Any leader that can organize his units and make sure they control the material shall win. What he's saying in this is any leader that can make sure that they have everything they need, food and supplies, and make sure that the men are completely understanding of their factor and method, they can win as long as they know the tactics and strategy. In chapter 2, doing the war. War requires 1,000 chariots and heavy carts. That was one of the first lines in his sentence. It also requires hundreds of thousands of armed men. He's saying that you have to have a well-organized army. You have to have hundreds of thousands of men to defeat other armies. You want to outnumber. It makes it easier to outnumber armies than it is to be less. He also says in this chapter 2 that a fast war is a lot better than a slow war because a fast war keeps your men not fatigued. He also says that a slow war is just dictating a slow victory. You never guaranteed a victory in war, as everybody knows, looking throughout history. But if you can push and push and push against the enemy forces, you can tire them and possibly win. The main aspect is make sure you can supply your troops. He also says the best way to win in a fast or slow war is cut the food off from the enemy soldiers. You want to take their supplies. You want to feed your men with their food. Basically what he's saying with this is if you weaken the enemies and take everything they have away from them, they'll be fatigued, tired, weak. Your men will be very strong and it'll be a quick and swift win. Chapter 3. Those who make everyone see a common goal will be champions. Those who have the best strategies will win. Those who outsmart and outnumber will win. Don't attack walled cities unless needed, and don't let anger overcome you, as this leads to death. In chapter 3, what he's trying to get by is that a general that has great strategy understands his enemy's complete tactics should win. Just like in modern day terms, if you assume that you're going to win, you're going to make an ass out of you and me. So what he's saying in this chapter is a great general knows everything. He knows where their supplies are coming from, how they're going to attack, how his army is going to attack, and how he's going to send his men. If you have to attack a walled city, he says it takes time. And in his book, he tells you that you should not do a long war. You'd have to make wall berserks, and you'd have to barricade, and you'd have to break through the wall. And eventually, the general gets so pissed that he'll just send his men into the front gates, which is just a funnel of death, as he calls it. If a general gets angry and doesn't keep to his strategy, he'll just kill all of his men, 1/3 gone in a snap of a finger, and then there's no going back. So, in the first 3 chapters, what he's telling you is keep an easy set in mind. Make sure your men understand everything you understand and they're willing to die for you, and make sure everybody has a common goal.
Going to be talking about chapters 4 through 6 in our source. It talked a lot about the different methods used when fighting a war. I think one of the things that stuck out most was the method of war. First is measuring, second is estimating, third is counting, fourth is comparing, and fifth is gauging. It was really important in ancient Chinese culture for them to be aware and be very detailed in their attention to quantitative evidence. And they really liked to pay attention to kind of just other things that whoever they were fighting was doing, and they really liked to measure their success. They were also not really conventional fighters. They really prided themselves on being different and thinking outside of the box. They were really important just overall in fighting wars, like the history of war. Ancient Chinese culture was really formative for this. So one thing that they did say in our source was the basic battle configurations are only the conventional and unconventional, yet the transformation of these 2 types of tactics afford infinite possibilities. The conventional and unconventional gives rise to each other like a circle that has neither beginning nor end. Who could ever exhaust their potential? So they believed that you needed to fight the good fight no matter what was necessary. They believed that both conventional and unconventional methods, so like traditional ways of doing things, and untraditional ways of doing things were both equally as important and necessary, and that they fed into each other. So it said, like a circle that has neither beginning nor end, they're connected. They're not two separate things, they're the same thing. Excuse me. Sorry, it's not. So they believed that the battle was the most important, not necessarily the most important part of fighting a war, but also it was about who was fighting, how they were being led, and all of the different things that lead into it. So they focused not only on their strategy, but they also really focused on their leadership and the different ways in which they organized their troops. So generals were really, really important in their culture, and especially in their culture of war and within their troops. They believed that the general needed to be a strong leader and that the general needed to be without his own thoughts. Like, he needed to be for the cause and he needed to be in total control but not have anyone controlling him. They also believed that he who is skilled in battle controls the movement of others, but does not allow his own movements to be controlled by others. The ability to cause the enemy to come of his own accord is the result of enticing him with advantage. The ability to cause the enemy not to come is the result of dissuading him with disadvantage. So they believed that it was really important to remain in control all of the time, which is still used in our wars today. They believed, and honestly became an idea all throughout the wars in different histories. So they believed that the having control in the battle and having an advantage was one of the most important things. And they believed that you needed to be manipulating them into being at a disadvantage, and you needed to manipulate yourself and your troops into an advantage. If you'll excuse me again, sorry, I'm just having some technical difficulties. They also believed that the soldiers needed to work together. They needed to be not like they needed to have their control, but they needed to cooperate with the people on their side of the battle. And they compared it to a water, like a body of water. So it says the form of a body of soldiers resembles that of water. Water's natural form is such that it avoids heights and rushes towards depths. The natural form of a body of soldiers is such that it avoids solidity and strikes at emptiness. Water produces currents in accordance with the terrain. Soldiers produce victory in accordance with the enemy. So it's kind of really deep that it really is saying that, you know, water doesn't go up, it doesn't go to the hardest spot on top of a mountain. It goes somewhere where it's easier to flow. And soldiers are not going to strike a larger group of soldiers if there's a smaller group of the enemy that's easier to strike at. And that's what's going to bring success for them. And then also it says water produces currents in accordance with the terrain. The soldiers have to use what the enemy is doing just already. So that is kind of like the earth, like the terrain. So water doesn't just form its own path immediately, it follows the terrain that is available. And soldiers need to do the same thing. They need to take into account and into their minds what the enemy is doing and what they need to do in order to cause success. So, yeah, that's basically all I have on chapters 4 through 6. And it really is just a lot about the importance of generalship and the importance of having a strong leader and having strong soldiers who can work well together.
Chapter 7 mainly refers to being prepared and planning accordingly to your battles. One of the main things is that you want to be the first to your destination. That includes being the first to figure out any cities or towns that are nearby where you could find information to help you out about the terrain, learn everything you can about the area that you're about to fight in. Another thing is that it doesn't matter how good your army is, if you have the fastest, the strongest. It doesn't matter what type of warriors you have if you get outsmarted. So that's why you have to plan accordingly. And you also have to make sure that you don't run out or forget any supplies. So that's another good reason to get to your place early and plan so that once you have all of your stuff, you can focus on just winning the war. Another thing is when you're planning on fighting, you have to know the exact moment when to strike. Like the middle of the day would be a terrible option because that's when everyone's alert and ready for stuff, especially if they know that a war is coming. So that's another thing. Some rules that you should follow that chapter 7 tells you is that you should never fight an uphill battle because it leaves you at a major disadvantage. You should not bite on bait when they give you a small group of guys to fight because they're probably trying to trap you. And if the enemy is retreating, do not follow them because they could be setting up a trap for you. Then we get into chapter 8, which, like I said about the advantages, this one says that you should always be mindful of your advantages and your disadvantages. Some of those are knowing and picking and choosing the correct battles, because there are certain cities and stuff that Master Sun said that he would not go near or attack certain armies. There's certain orders that he wouldn't take, and there's paths that he knows that he would cross the wrong people, so he wouldn't go anywhere near there and compromise himself. You have to be wise when you're preparing for war and knowing your advantages and disadvantages. So a way you can do that is by knowing the terrain and how you can use that to your advantage, whether that be if it's like a hilly area, if there's dry grass, wet grass, all the above. So you have to pay very close attention to all your advantages, disadvantages, try to make those minimal as possible. And overall, war just depends on your readiness for preparing for your battles. Just like with chapter 7, it all ties together with just being ready for anything that comes at you. And as we go into chapter 9 actually talks a lot about the advantages that you could take, just like, again, with the uphill battles, that you want to be the ones on top of the hill, and that the sun, you can use the sun to your advantage to help blind your enemies and have a good attack on them. And other things like rivers and like tall grass and everything like that you can use to your advantage. and because you don't want to get caught in the middle of it and screw your army over, basically. And chapter 9 is just all about your advantages that you should look out for. And yeah, everything in these chapters revolves around using your elements and your terrain to your advantage, because someone who's the master of all 9 of the varieties of terrain will almost guarantee his victory, because he can outsmart and just overall be a better warrior than his opponent. So these are all tied together in that aspect of using your advantages, but you also have to be mindful about the disadvantages that this could bring you, especially if you're going somewhere that you've never been before. So these are all just things that is basically, to summarize it up, to be mindful of when you are preparing for war and whoever you have to fight.
In this chapter on terrain types, Master Sun Tzu focuses on the topography of the layout of the land. One of the biggest things that's mentioned so much is a term called ZCHI, which translates to the English term of no. This particular term is mentioned upwards of 13, 14 times throughout the chapter, so you know it must be of some kind of importance. The first type of terrain that's talked about is accessible. Accessible terrain is a path of which both me and your enemy shall pass with ease. Accessible terrain is not something that's usually used for battle because of how easy it is to enter and exit. Number 2, hanging. Hanging terrain is a path of which it is easy to go down but difficult to return. The reason that hanging is important is if the enemy is not prepared, you should conquer him in a hanging terrain. If the enemy is prepared and you go forth, you will not be able to conquer him, for the advantages will be in his field. The third type is branching. Branching is a path with many points of entry and exits. This terrain is a non-advantage for both you and your enemy because of the difficulty it would be to know the layout and to be able to plan a strategic attack. The next one is narrow. It's pretty self-explanatory. It's a path with usually 2 openings, 1 entry, 1 exit, which can be entered and exited from either side. The only advantage that you find in a narrow path is if you're able to occupy it before your enemy does. If you occupy it before your enemy does, the most common thing to do and most strategic thing to do is to fill it and then await the arrival of your enemy. If you come to the narrow path and your enemy has already filled it and is waiting on you, the smartest thing to do is to withdraw, or else your army will perish. The next one is precarious, terrain that usually has high points and low points. When I say high points and low points, it's usually a path that runs along a cliffside or a path that runs along a ravine. In this case, the best course of attack is to have high ground. High ground is something that's pretty much the best case scenario, no matter what the layout of the terrain is. And then distant. Distant terrain is not an advantage for both sides. It will only be an advantage if the enemy is not comparable to you. So the size of your army comes in. The size of your army is a heavy factor in your success on a distant terrain. Now, there's a lot of things that are hinted at and like small pieces of advice, but one of the biggest pieces of advice that's listed back in this chapter is a good leader looks upon his troops as beloved sons and not disposable. So like me personally, what I think that means is if you look upon your troops as your own sons, you will do your best to set them up for a victory rather than a failure. These 6 cases of terrain help to illustrate different ways that terrain can affect battle and different ways to use and approach these different types of terrain for the best possible success. Chapter 11. In this chapter, it is more emphasized on how to use one's forces on different types of terrain. Since there's so many, I don't want to list them all because it would kind of take away from what the chapter itself is really about. But a few that I'll cover is dispersed. Dispersed, when you battle on your own territory that is known to you or to your enemy, that is known as dispersed terrain. The next one is easy.
Chapter 12 is over incendiary attacks used against men, grain, carts, storehouses, and supply lines. Under the right conditions, and supplies must be on hand, a suitable time to use an incendiary attack is when it is dry and the moon is in one of these 4 lunar lodges when the wind blows strongly. The 4 lunar lodges are Willowing Basket, Wall, Wing, and Carriage Crossboard. Supports attack with fire or water. Fire yields obvious results. Water yields impressive results. Both breaks up enemy forces, but it cannot deprive the enemy of his material. A precautious ruler is cautious because it brings security to the state and keeps army intact. Chapter 13 is over spies. The reason the persuasive lord and the wise general are victorious over others when they mobilize, and the reason their accomplishments exceed those of the masses is their foreknowledge. Foreknowledge must be gained through people, specifically those who know the circumstances of the enemy, like spies. There are 5 different types of spies. First is the excuse, drawn from the local people among the enemy. Second, inside agents, drawn from the officials of the enemy. Third, double agents, from agents of the enemy. 4, those who risk death. They do so because we disseminate false information. Lastly, those who escape with their lives, which are those who return to make a report. Having all 5 working at the same time, the enemy will not be able to inform himself of their hidden ways. This is called miraculous conduct. Spies are an important element to warfare. As an example, the Qing dynasty used a double agent against the Zhou dynasty.